Dr Manouchehr Ganji served as Iran's Minister for Education from 1976 to 1979, as well as Minister of Science and Higher Education in 1977. He had earlier acted as an advisor to Prime Minister Hoveyda between the years of 74 and 76. After the Islamic Revolution, Dr. Ganji escaped Iran on foot via Turkey. 6 months later, other not-so-lucky ex-government officials like Amir Abbas Hoveyda were captured and immediately executed by revolutionary guards. Thank you very much. Dr. Ganji, please tell us, did you see the Shah in person during his last days in Iran? If so, please explain to us his physical and emotional state during your visit.
Yes, I saw him on several occasions. I saw him as I was Minister of Science and Higher Education and Minister of Education. I resigned as minister about 2 months before revolution, because the revolutionaries had issued a list of names of people holding high powers and saying that they had taken so much money out of the country. My name was on that list, saying that I had taken $37 million out of the country, whereas I didn't have a penny outside of Iran, and my bank account in Iran at the end of the month was coming to nearly zero. And I was borrowing from my close friends in those days of revolution to survive. And I borrowed to come out of the country. So when that list came out, all of those ministers either resigned or they were removed. I went to the Shah and I said, I want to resign. He said, do whatever you think is best for you. And so I resigned. I wasn't a member of the government during Azhari or during Bakhtiar, but before I had been a member of the government.
Please tell us about the last times that you saw the Shah in Iran, what you saw of him, what did you think about him, his mental situation, his physical situation. Did he look sick? Did he look tired? Please tell us about those last visits that you had with him.
Well, looking at it today, I can see very well that Shah had been ill, really, during at least the last 2 years of rule. Before, I had started seeing the Shah in mid-60s. From then on, early 60s, when he came and he was visiting students in Switzerland were received by him. And in Iran, after I returned, I had seen him many times, being Secretary General of Iranian Human Rights Committee and attending UN meetings, and then having become Dean of Faculty of Law and Minister, so I had seen him often. In those meetings that I had with him, some of them would take an hour long. He would be walking in his big office, and maximum he had was a small cup of tea that they brought to him, and he would be drinking it while he was walking. Now towards the end, generally he sat down. That wasn't his habit of receiving people, and had the person who had come to see him sit next to him, either at his desk or there was another corner, there were chairs that he sat and had the visitor sit down too. And towards the end, I saw him ring the bell, the attendant came and he ordered a glass of water. They brought him a tall glass of water. He would be drinking the water and finish it, and 10-15 minutes later, he rang the bell, the attendant came, asked for another glass of water. This wasn't the Shah I had seen before. And very often, before, he would continue on the subject that you had come to see him for an hour or even longer. Now, he was impatient. He wanted to finish the meeting as soon as he possibly could. And very often, before he used to take a decision on what you were suggesting to him, now he was saying, we will see about it. Very often he will say, we will see about it. So now looking at it after so many years, on foresight, yes, one could, now I can tell that he was ill.
Besides the fatigue and the change in mannerism, did you see anything in his physical presence, in his face? We've heard that in the last years in power, the last year or two, he was heavily medicated on Valium. So people saw like a caved-in face, the bags under the eyes. Did you notice that, just the physical appearance of a sick man? Or was he still covering it pretty well?
He was covering himself pretty well. Except, I said,
For those things.
the fact that when he received people, he went and sat down and had his guest sit next to him, which wasn't his habit of doing that with us. He did that with foreign visitors, ambassadors, and foreign dignitaries, not with us as ministers. And even with Prime Minister, he walked.
Yeah.
And he has a long office, so he would be walking, and whoever visiting him would be walking next to him.
How did the Shah's affinity for pleasing the religious Muslim clergy bring about the Islamic revolution in Iran?
Well, Shah had been always under influence of his fundamentalist mother, very much respectful of the clerics in Iran. In his very first book in English, Mission for My Country, you can see that he's going to Imam Zada Dawood, and he falls from the horse, and he writes that Imam Ali came and saved me. He usually went to religious functions. He went to Mecca, he went to Karbala, often he went to Mashhad for pilgrimage, and his picture was shown on television, and his statements were heard on radio and television. So it is mostly, as I said, from early childhood, under the influence of his fundamentalist mother, that he was, the religious aspect of his being was inculcated.
How much of it do you think was his personal belief, and how much of it was good politics of pleasing the religious classes?
I think it was his personal belief, most of it. You can see it throughout his rule. He always respected the clerics. He always put them on pedestal. And the pilgrimage he made them public. You can see him in Mecca in the special robe that they wear during the pilgrimage time with Ardeshi Zahidi. That was shown in all the TVs and cinemas in Iran. And the same thing was true of Mashhad and other places he went. So it was something within him.
During his last days in power, why did the Shah imprison and alienate his supporters, while at the same time freeing and empowering his enemies and detractors? And under whose orders was this done?
All of that was done under his orders. But he was influenced, of course, with those who were around him and who were advising him. I think two of them were essential. One was Mr. Reza Qutbi, who was heading the radio and television, and Dr. Hossein Nasr, who was heading the Queen's Bureau. They were the ones who were influencing him most of the time during that period. And they were the ones, in fact, who wrote the speech for him that he delivered on radio and television at noon towards the end, just about 2 months before the end, 2 months and a half. And he addressed the people by saying, I have heard your voice of the revolution.
Mr. Nasr and Mr. Qutbi are close confidants of the Queen. Are we to assume that the Queen took on a bigger role towards the end advising the Shah and running the affairs of the country?
Definitely true. Although the Queen in years before was in the background, but in the months before the revolution, she was attending most of the meeting. I remember that a meeting that the Shah had called with, as I referred, several ministers, military officers, at night about 6 o'clock, and I arrived at the meeting at 8 because I was attending another meeting, and I learned about it later. At that meeting, Queen was sitting next to the Shah, and they were talking about what to do, whether we should order military to take over and have martial law, or whether we should continue as before. So, and other times, the speech she delivered to the nation by saying, "I've heard your voice of revolution," as I said, was prepared by Queen's closest confidant and closest relative, Mr. Nasr and Mr. Qutbi. And before they brought the speech to the Shah, they took the speech to the Queen in her office in the same compound.
In your last meeting with him, what did you advise him to do? And what plan of action did he take?
Well, towards the end, after that list came out that all these ministers had sent so much money out of the country, and they arrested many ministers and top military officers, and even the Prime Minister, Hoveyda, was arrested. So not many had been left inside the country. And I used to telephone the Shah and tell him that situation is getting worse. You have to do something. And then go and see him and ask him to declare a state of emergency and martial law. And my understanding was that the best military man of the time who could be in charge of the martial law was General Owaisi. So at one time I asked, I didn't know that what Mr. Qutbi's opinions were, and I didn't know what Mr. Amir Tahiri, a good friend of mine, his opinions were. But I invited them to my house, and we had a 2-hour meeting. I told them the situation is getting from bad to worse, and it can't continue like this. The revolutionaries are taking over. So we have to do something, and we have to go and talk to the king. They both agreed, and they said, what should we talk to him about? I said, declaration of state of emergency, and also putting the military in charge. And the man I thought, the best military man of the time, was Owaisi, who was in charge of the martial law. So they said, all right. I telephoned the king's office, and I talked with Mr. Afshar, who is now in France. I asked him for an appointment. He gave us an appointment immediately the next day. So Mr. Qutbi, Mr. Tahiri, and myself, we went to see the king. He took us to a corner of his office. He sat down, and he had the three of us sit down, which was unusual again. And then I talked most of the time. I didn't know that Mr. Qutbi had been seeing him and asking him to compromise and do all of those things. But I thought he was of the same opinion as me, because that's how he showed himself when he was in my house. And Mr. Tahiri too. So Mr. Tahiri and Qutbi sat, and I talked and told the Shah that the situation of the country is turning from bad to worse. We had just passed Ashura, and during Ashura, there were thousands and tens of thousands in the streets, and with slogans against the king. And also in gas stations, they didn't have enough gasoline, so there were big lines while hundreds of cars were waiting before all gas stations. Motorcyclists were coming and going, passing all the line and going in front. And getting gas, and these motorcyclists were controlling the crowd when they came out in the streets, the crowd which was against the Shah, so that they won't leave the demonstration. They were going back and forth, so nobody would leave. The two of them kept absolutely silent, and when I said, Owaisi is the man that we need today, Shah telephoned Owaisi and said, Ganji is here with some others, and he's going to come and see you and talk to you. So the next day, I arranged to see Owaisi, and I telephoned Mr. Tahiri and Mr. Qutbi. Mr. Tahiri and Qutbi didn't answer the phone, no matter how many times I called them. Then I called some of my own members of my own group that we had been seeing the Queen for many years. So with a few of them, about 11 of them, the next day we went to see General Owaisi. And we spent about 2 hours with General Owaisi telling him that you have to do something, and the king wants you to do something. Unfortunately, Owaisi wasn't the man that I was thinking, because while we were in his office, at noon, he told us that he had to say his noon prayer. So they brought him a aftabe, and he went and took wuzu, and he came and stood up there while we were sitting. For about 15 minutes, he was praying. So he prayed, and then he came to the table. And I told myself that in all probabilities, I'm wrong in my assessment of his being a very tough person. But finally, under the pressure by the American and the British ambassadors who had seen the Shah before, he had been convinced that a state of emergency had to be issued and martial law had to be issued. But rather than calling on Owaisi, he had called the American ambassador and the British ambassador to his office to get their advice. And they had agreed on Azhari being in charge of the martial law. And unfortunately, the next day, Azhari went to the Senate and started his speech by Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which he had never done as a military man in a public meeting like that. And he wasn't really the man of the time.
Please explain to us why the Shah did not listen to you, as well as others who advised them on a stronger stance. You told him to do martial law, put a stronger stance, put a lot of people in prison, but he did the opposite of it. He freed a lot of prisoners. He took a softer approach. Why did he do that? Please help us understand what was his rationale for doing that.
Well, I told you that in my opinion, those days, we are talking about the last 2 months, 3 months, the Queen was running the country, in fact.
What was her rationale?
Her advisors, Mr. Nasr, who was a supporter of the clerics, who took the Queen to Karbala during these very hard times. They went to Karbala to visit the cleric who was in Karbala, to ask him to support the regime, which he would never to do that, because Khomeini didn't have the best of relations with him, the religious leader of the... And they wanted to see Khomeini when they went to Iraq, to Karbala. Khomeini didn't see them, refused to receive them. So they came back. Therefore, in fact, the Shah wasn't in charge. In fact, when I telephoned, he had told me, I had told him, the BBC is making trouble for Iran every night by magnifying all the demonstrations and everything against the regime. And people are listening to it. And I said to him, we have the best of relations with Great Britain, and BBC belongs to the British government. Why don't you react and tell the British you are interfering in our domestic affairs? He sent his Minister of Foreign Affairs of the time I think it was Afshar Qasimlu. He sent him to Great Britain to tell them, stop it. And they said, we have no control on BBC. So BBC continued. He had difficult times to act really. He wanted his, whereas before, he would decide when you read Alam's books that he was taking decisions against the views of the Western countries in many ways. These days, he always wanted to consult Great Britain and the United States and also other Western countries like Germany, France. And there they had taken a position in Guadeloupe in particular to support the Khomeini. And before then, they had come to the conclusion that the Shah is not the man to run the country anymore. And the Shah's raising of the oil price and quite a lot of other things that he had done, they were not really happy with his decisions of those days.
What was Heuser's role in Iran, and how did he neutralize the military?
Well, Heuser, as you know, was deputy commander of NATO, and a very high position militarily. He had been to Iran before, and he knew Iran more or less, and he knew particularly top military people in Iran. So all of a sudden, Carter decided to send Heuser to Iran. And the purpose of that, this is after the Guadeloupe meeting of US, Great Britain, France, and Germany, the leaders of those four countries. There they had come to the conclusion that the Shah's days are finished. So Heuser comes to Iran to make sure Iranian military doesn't really act against the revolutionaries and doesn't get involved. Heuser enters Iran without Shah's knowledge, which is contrary to all the accepted norms of international relations. A head of a state should be informed when a high up emissary is being sent to a country. So they showed, in fact, to Iranian military that they were not taking Shah anymore very seriously. So Heuser enters Iran and directly taken to the US Embassy. He stays at the US Embassy, and Qarabaghi, who was in charge of the Iranian armed forces, commander of Iranian armed forces, he gives him an office next to his office without the knowledge of Shah. So Heuser is going back and forth. After a few days, Shah learns that Heuser is in Iran, and he has come without his knowledge, and he in fact is officing next to Qarabaghi's office. When he receives Qarabaghi, he tells Qarabaghi, "What's this, Heuser?" And Qarabaghi doesn't know what to say. So Shah says, "I know that he is officing next to yours." So it is at that time that the ambassador asks Heuser to ask for an appointment to see the Shah. And the ambassador and Heuser together come to see the Shah. And what they make, from then on, they are making more or less clear to the Shah that they are not really supporting him and they are supporting the revolutionaries. Shah at this time, in fact, knew that his military had taken a top military man, which was Qarabaghi, had taken a position on the side of the Americans. And the head of the Air Force was the only military man that had come to see the Shah and told the Shah that we can bomb some places that the revolutionaries' source of power comes from. And Shah had said no. Shah was not a man for the time. because he couldn't take any tough, rough decisions.
How much of a factor was that in the generals kind of dealing with the West? The fact that there was a vacuum of power, Shah was not making the decisions, so the military had to look to somewhere for leadership. You think that had something to do with the fact that the military gravitated towards Heuser, the fact that the Shah was kind of vacant in his decision making?
Well, the Shah had declared a state of martial law. Shah had placed at the beginning Owaisi in charge of the martial law. And now Qarabaghi was in charge. So the military were in the streets. But they were telling the military not to react in any way. When the crowd even was calling the military all kinds of names, the military did not react in any way to harm the demonstrators and the supporters of Khomeini.
When did you personally become aware that the Shah had cancer? When did you become aware of his illness?
After the revolution. I didn't really, as I told you, now looking at it from all I know today, those days I had seen some symptoms of something unusual is going on. The Shah that always walked with us is sitting every time we go to see him and asks us to sit with him, which he did only with foreign visitors. And the Shah, who only took a little tea, a stecone tea, now is drinking so much water. Therefore, those symptoms on hindsight, I went back to what I had seen those days, but none of us suspected that the Shah was sick.
There was rumors spread during the last days of the revolution. We've heard that the rumors came from the Russians around Iran that the Shah had cancer 2-3 months before he left. Were you aware of those rumors?
No. Oh, I have read about it, that the Russians have said that they knew before revolution that Shah had cancer. I have read about it, but at that time, no, not at all. Not, at least not me. I didn't know anything about his illness, and I think most people like me didn't know anything about his illness. But what we saw, which was unbelievable, was a man who was ordering arrest and imprisonment of some of the most loyal people to him, military and civilian, like Hoveyda, like Nasiri, like many others, being put in prison.
Now, I know he was the final decision maker. Well, was that his decision or the Queen and her entourage?
I think most of it was Queen and her entourage. I really think those days, those decisions were imposed on the Shah, and it wasn't him who had taken the initiative.
Which takes us to the next question. Please explain to us, I know we've kind of talked about this, but I'd like to get to this in a little more detail. Please explain to us what role the Queen played during the final days of the Pahlavi dynasty. What was her role? I mean, she was the regent, she was Naib al-Sultaneh, so it was expected of her to take action. I know history doesn't tell us anything about what actions she took, what she tried to do to preserve the dynasty, but what role did she play in the final days?
She wasn't. While the Shah was still alive, she didn't have any role to play, legally.
Correct.
By Iranian constitution. And it was only after the death of the Shah, and if the son of the Shah had not reached the age of maturity, that she could have succeeded. So before, she never interfered in matters of states like this. But at this time, she had learned of Shah's illness about a year before the revolution. The only people who knew about the Shah's illness was Mr. Safavian, who was his doctor, Iranian doctor, where the the Austrian doctors, and maybe a French doctor. And that's all the people who knew about his. Even Alam didn't know fully about the illness of the Shah, the closest person to him. Of course, at this time, he was in a hospital in France, Alam, with the same kind of illness as the Shah had.
The reason I asked this question that way is because it's a very sticky point of our story with the Queen. In her defense, she's in a tough situation where she looks bad both ways. If she doesn't do anything and she knows her husband is dying and he has cancer and he can't make decisions, then the blame falls on her. If she does do something, then the blame still falls on her. She was in a difficult position. I understand that. What we're just trying to wonder is what she did. I know a lot of the things she did, it would have had to been behind the screens because, while the Shah is alive, as you just said, she can't take any action. But at the same time, you understand the position. Her husband is gravely ill. He's dying of cancer. The country's fallen apart. She is the future regent.
If you read my books, Defying the Iranian Revolution and other books I have written, I talk about my relations with the Queen, which started some 14 years before the revolution. And a study group that we had, and we often saw the Queen and prepared reports on economic, social, cultural, and political situation in Iran and made suggestions to her. But since I became minister, I was so much involved with the work of Ministry of Education and then Ministry of Science and Higher Education. And I was in touch all the time for whatever questions with the Shah personally. So I wasn't seeing her as often. And she never telephoned and asked me for any advice, opinion, or the group. We were some altogether over 100 people over 14 years I had gathered in all fields of life. She never asked for any advice. She never said that the situation is emergency situation and we needed to do something. So the only people that she had around as advisors were Mr. Nasr, who was heading her office, and Mr. Qutbi. And Qutbi was closest advisor to her. And she didn't feel that she needed anybody else. They acted and got people around and went and advised her. And Shah also was depending on her. The very first time I saw the Shah at a meeting, important meeting, with the Queen sitting on top, and the Prime Minister and all the top brass military and some other ministers, and I was amongst them, sitting, is about, in fact, it was 16 Mehr, 16th of Mehr, because that was the Teacher's Day. I was at a function preparing for from whatever program we had for 16th of Mehr. They came and showed me and left a note in front of me saying that Shah has asked for you to go to a meeting at Sadabad Palace. So I finished my meeting and I got there by about 8:30 in the evening, and I found out that others had been there since 6:30, 6 or 6:30. And Queen and the Shah were sitting on top of the table, and military and others. And first time that I saw the Queen and the Shah sitting at an important function, political function like that, together. So at this time, during this time, he was more and more depending on her advice and her entourage.
Please tell us about your trip to the United States, Aspen in particular, with the Queen. What was the purpose of the trip?
As you know, there is the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. It was created many years ago in Aspen, Colorado, over 70 to 80 years ago. Our ambassador to the UN was Feridun Hoveyda, brother of Amir Abbas Hoveyda. Feridun Hoveyda had been invited several times to Aspen meetings, and he was advising Aspen on Iran, in fact. And Feridun Hoveyda had advised the Queen to become honorary member of the Board of Trustees of Aspen. So the Queen had accepted, and she was now honorary member of the Board of Trustees of Aspen. One day, out of the blues, I was, at that time, advisor to the Prime Minister, Amir Abbas Hoveyda. One day, out of the blues, Hoveyda telephoned me and said, there are some people from Aspen Institute, and right now they are in Mr. Qutbi's office, and I want you to go to that meeting and report to me about the result of discussions. So I went to the meeting in Mr. Qutbi's office. There were 6 couples from Aspen, board of directors, who had come to Iran, and Mr. Jafarian, who was executed at the beginning of revolution, and Mr. Nikha, who was also executed, and Mr. Qutbi were attending a meeting. There I realized that these people were asking Iran to provide $20 million or $25 million for Aspen programs. At that time, the oil price had gone up, and many people were coming to take money from Iran. After that meeting, they had a meeting with Mr. Nahavandi. Nahavandi was then the Chancellor of Tehran University. I had to go to Nahavandi's office while they were in Nahavandi's office. There, Mr. Nahavandi promised to give whatever he could as Chancellor of Tehran University for meetings that they had in Iran, conference room and other things. So when I got home late at night, Amir Abbas Hoveyda, Prime Minister, telephoned me and said, tell me what happened. I told him the vultures have started flying. The vultures. He said, what do you mean vultures have started flying? I said, Iran has a little money now from oil. Oil price had been tripled or quadrupled, and everybody is coming to Iran to take part of the money. And these guys are here to take $20 or $25 million for Aspen programs. Whereas there are rich people in the United States who are helping Aspen. He told me, can you write that and bring that to me in your handwriting? So I wrote it down. And I said that the vultures have started flying. I took it to him about 7:30 in the morning. And he took it to the Queen, and the Shah saw my note. So Hoveyda telephoned me and said, you are suggesting that we tell them that we can help them whenever they have a meeting, we will attend their meetings, or if they have meetings in Iran, we pay for the meetings in Iran. I said, yes. So he said, prepare a note. I prepared a note. I gave it to him. He took it to the Queen. It was accepted, and that was the kind of relation that Iran entertained with Aspen Institute after that. After that, the first action, first activity with Aspen Institute's participation was a meeting at the hotel near Persepolis, which brought together experts in economic, social, cultural, and human rights fields, studying the problems of and issues that Iran was facing in that regard. And 165 foreign participants attended it, and about 60 Iranian participants attended it. And the recommendation of that conference can be found in a book called Iran, Past, Present, and Future by Aspen Institute.
How about the Queen's trip to the United States to Aspen?
I was then, at this time, advisor to the Prime Minister. I wasn't minister. And Queen, as I told you, had been elected as a member of Board of Trustees of the Aspen. So every summer she had to attend the Board of Trustees meeting at Aspen Institute in Colorado. So next time she went to Aspen, as person who was advisor of Prime Minister and I was advising the Queen, I went to her with her to Aspen Institute. Mr. Zahedi was present also in Colorado at the meetings, and then the following year the same. The following year we usually came to Washington, and from Washington we went to Aspen. And Washington she stayed at the embassy. The second time, I found out that she had met with Carter. Now there are rumors that at that time she had told Carter that Shah was ill with cancer. That I don't know whether that is true or not. But that is the time that she had learned about Shah's cancer, the second trip.
The second trip was in 1976. 76. We had heard, and there was a lot of rumors, and I know you can't confirm it either way, that the Queen had in fact come to the United States, talked to President Carter, issued a warning that the Shah was sick, he was gravely ill, that he wouldn't last long, and that the Queen asked for the support of the United States, support of the Carter administration in a transition of power between the Shah and the Queen as regent. Now, do you have any information to confirm or anything to collaborate with this story that we've heard? Did you see anything at that time made this kind of make sense or anything?
Now we are talking about a year, more than a year before revolution.
Yes. Well, she still knew that the Shah was
she
sick.
She knew
that the Shah was
sick. She had
sick.
come to know only about that time that Shah was ill and had been seeing the Austrian and French doctors and Mr. Safavian.
Well, in her book, she says that she learned it in the 1 year before, but we've have 3 interviews that she's done that she said that she knew from an earlier time that her husband was sick.
But whatever, maximum is a year and a half that she knew, maximum. She couldn't have known anything about it before that time. So I really don't think she would do that. She would go to Carter and tell him to support the Reza Pahlavi and support her to succeed the king. No, I don't think so. Maximum is that she told Carter that Shah was ill. Maximum. And I'm not sure if that took place. Meeting took place.
But you weren't there at the meeting.
No. Shizadi wasn't there either.
He told me he wasn't there.
Yeah.
That's why I'd like to know what went on in that meeting, because it's highly irregular for the Queen to meet with the President of the United States.
Yes, it is.
Without the ambassador of any of her confidants.
And also it is highly irregular for Queen to meet with the President of the United States without the prior knowledge of the Shah.
Correct.
So if she did, Shah knew of what she was going to tell the President of the United States.
That's a good point. Now, I just,
because it wasn't a secret meeting. We at the embassy, we had meetings at the embassy. This is when we were going back to Iran from Aspen, that we had stopped in Washington.
So the Shah knew that the
Shah
Queen
knew,
met
and all
Carter.
of us in the embassy, we knew that the Queen went to see Carter, but we didn't know what was the purpose of the meeting.
Now, Ambassador Zahedi says that meeting was only between the Queen and Mrs. Carter, and that President Carter didn't attend.
That's not true. From what we heard her say, she had met with President Carter.
I've looked at old newspaper clippings and stuff. And you're
also,
right,
if it was Mrs. Carter would have come to the embassy rather than her going and seeing Mrs. Carter and not seeing her husband.
Good point. Now, I just want to bring this, get your opinion on this. We've been trying to contact the Queen from the first day of this project. We wanted her input. We wanted her to look at the research that we've done and kind of comment about her husband's illness, about what went on in those final days, about how her husband died. Not only has she not agreed to talk to us, she has asked a lot of the people involved, like Dr. Flandrin, the French doctor, Robert Armau, the Rockefeller assistant who was handling the affairs, not to speak with us. I know you're close to her. You're close to the Pahlavis. Why do you think her rationale might be for not cooperating with us?
I really don't know. All I know is that I was very close to the Queen in Iran and also outside of Iran. The last 3 years, same situation with me. She is not in touch. And she has cut her relations with many people. And that is probably her age and her life. It's her private life. She takes a decision about what she does.
Thank you. Let's take the concentration a little away from the Queen. And we want to talk about the U.S., relations between the United States, the West, and the Shah. Why was the West and the U.S. not more supportive of the Shah in those final days? I mean, how did the Shah's actions and behavior during his last 10 years of his rule alienate his allies, particularly the Americans and the West?
Well, I think the quadrupling of the oil prices, from what I have read, Nixon knew about it, and the Americans didn't oppose it. But Shah very often tried to give lessons and teach the West about the way of running the affairs of their affairs, political, social, economic, and cultural affairs. That, I don't think, was well received in the West. That was one of the reasons, probably. The other thing, Shah wasn't really a lackey of the United States, in my opinion, or a lackey of Great Britain. He wanted to have the best of relations in the previous years with them, but he didn't want to follow their footsteps and follow whatever they suggested to him. Towards the end, he had become much more independent of them. And he was deciding in the way that he thought was best for Iran with advice of the Iranians who were around him. But since his illness, things change, particularly the last 2 years of his illness. When Alam was alive, still alive, things were different. But after Alam was no longer around, which is about a year and a half, situation deteriorated more and more because there wasn't anyone who could carry on a dialogue with the Shah. Alam carried out, when one reads his books, now there are 7 volumes. Ali Khani has done a great job of making that, preparing them and printing them and putting it at our disposal. When we read those, we realize how lonely he is in the last year of his rule. So he's turning again more and more towards the West. But the West is under the influence of the opposing forces in the United States and in Europe. This development, Shah had come to the States with the Queen a year before, right in front of the White House. The gathering against the Shah and use of tear gas and all that, which was unusual, the situation. Although Ardeshizadeh had arranged for supporters of the Shah also to come to Washington, and they demonstrated also. But things had changed. The whole thing had changed. And the problem for the Shah was, first he was under the influence of the medication he was taking, which nobody knew about except him, and towards the end the Queen, and also the opposition forces outside were organizing themselves, and little by little, when a country like United States became aware that Shah cannot hold on to power, they were looking for replacement of the regime. And
now you brought up an interesting point about his illness. From our findings of what Mr. Afshar and the doctor said, that the illness existed from late 60s, early 70s. And the Shah may have known it at that time earlier than anybody else did, even his doctors. Now, how much of it do you think the relations, I'm talking about the souring of the relations between the US and Iran, how much of it do you think was the illness? In two ways. One, the West saw the Shah as ill, and they didn't see him as having the same longevity and the same length of stay. And at the same time, the Shah himself knew that once he gets sick, that support wouldn't be there.
Well, from what I have read, Shah had asked his doctors about, once he becomes aware of the kind of illness he has, about longevity of his rule. How long is he going to live? They had told him 8 to 10 years.
Right.
And he had said, okay, that's good enough, 8 to 10 years. So he was giving himself 8 to 10 years. But gradually his health situation was deteriorating. And we could see it, particularly when the opposing forces were gaining momentum. The situation in Iran was deteriorating. And at these times, certainly outside of Iran, countries like United States, United Kingdom, France had become aware of the fact that Shah is ill, and were not depending on him very much in ruling a country, and they were looking for replacement, and they wanted to establish relations. So that's how Khomeini comes to Paris, and supporters of Khomeini gained support from the United States. Mr. Yazdi and Mr. Qutbzadeh and Mr. Chamran had been in touch with the State Department, with American government, for a number of years. They never received a green light, but after those demonstrations, when Shah visited around the White House, the use of tear gas, and then the quadrupling of oil prices and all the problems that followed it, I think they gave hand to hand in bringing the downfall of the Shah.
Why did the Shah decide to keep his illness secret, both for his rationale for keeping it from his own people as well as the West?
Definitely, I think he was under the opinion that Iranians, once they learn about his illness, would not be supportive of him as before. That's his assessment.
Do you agree with that?
No. I think Iranians, in all probability, would have been more supportive of him, knowing that he's sick and he's trying to do his best, and probably, this is a probability I'm saying, probably they would have been more supportive of him. And he also feared for foreign countries becoming aware of his illness and withdrawing their support, because he was buying quite a lot of military equipment, Air Force, Navy, ground forces, and the export of oil to Europe, and quite a lot of other things, the relations that he had established over a long period of time with the West.
Now, why did the Shah decide to criticize the West, antagonize the West, while at the same time depending on the West, especially the US, as his main means of staying in power? I mean, they were his main supporters. I still cannot understand the rationale. Now, I asked you this question before. Do you think this was a miscalculation, or did he have a master plan? Was he, what he's doing seems like suicide. there's a group of people that are supporting you, arming your military, helping your economy, and at the same time, you're criticizing these people. You're making life difficult for this group of people, particularly the West, with his raising of the price of oil.
I think he had reached a point that he wanted to prove to the Iranians that he wasn't a lackey of the United States, and he wasn't following orders from the United States and Great Britain for whatever he is doing in Iran. And then his health situation. He had given himself maximum, the doctor said 10 years, 8 to 10 years. He was in a hurry to do the things he wanted to do. The great civilization that he called it. The state of living inside Iran, that Iranians would be happy with their lot. So he had problems inside because he wanted to run very fast, faster than Iran was ready to absorb all the things that he wanted to do. And also he had the problem outside of Iran. Those who were looking at him as somebody who wanted to get everything quickly, and all he was concerned was Iran, and not about their problems that they were facing. And also in the region, countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia had relations with Iran, but they were not the best of allies of Iran. They had their own grand ideas, and the Shah was not really, first of all, the Shah was not treating them as equals. Shah considered Iran far above Saudi Arabia and above Iraq. And you could see it as with the things he did. For the first time, he took the boundary river between Iran and Iraq and asked that international law should decide the boundary between Iran and Iraq rather than the agreements that dated back to early 20th century that had given the whole river to Iraq. Same thing in Persian Gulf. The continental shelf of Iran, which is half of the Persian Gulf resources below the sea. So half to one side and the other half to many. There are countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and all of that. So they couldn't digest it, that Iran was becoming such a powerful country, and they had to continue as before. So there were all kinds of problems. It's not one, but it is conglomerate of different issues and problems.
As the leader of the opposition to the Islamic regime for the first 10 years after the revolution, I know you were running the group that was considered the main opposition, supported by the West. What do you think would have happened if the Shah had been alive 5 to 10 years longer than he was? Even though the revolution happened, with the Shah living in exile, how would that have affected the equation of the revolution and the effectiveness of the opposition?
If the Shah had not been ill and he had survived, definitely I think he would have, it would have had an effect on the power of the opposition and the situation that we see today in Iran. But a Shah who was ill, ailing Shah, even if he had lived 4 or 5 more years, I don't think it would have really affected very much the future of Iran.
Why do you think that the Shah's illness and the manner of his death has not been discussed in history. I mean, you talk to most Iranians, even the most knowledgeable supporters of the monarchy, and you ask them, how did the Shah die? Most of them can't tell you how he died. Why do you think his illness and when it started, how it evolved, how it was treated, how it was mistreated, and how it caused his death, why do you think it hasn't been talked about in history?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and people have to answer it. I think the relatives could have played an important role to bring that into light, more than they have done it. Because for future of Iran, also for history's sake, Iranians have to know all of the things you have been asking. They had neglected it. And I think Western countries played a role in that, because Western media is a free media. They could have delved into issues much more than they have. The scholars could have delved into the issue much more than they have. They have been touching the surface, and they haven't been going deep into the causes of the real causes of the Iranian Revolution. It's easy to blame everything on the Shah and on monarchy, and not to address all matters which helped together to bring the Iranian Revolution.
How do you think the Shah's fall, the revolution of 1979, how do you think that affected the world and what we see today, with especially the Middle East? How did that affect
very much
turnabout of what's going on here?
Very much so. Look at the Middle East. Look, even in Iraq, you have again the revival of fundamentalism. You look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Daesh, look at the Palestinian in the neighboring Lebanon. Look at Lebanon. Look at even Yemen, the whole region. Now there is a fundamentalist Islamic movement taking over country after country. Iranians, at least they have seen it in practice for 36 years. They know better than any people in the world what is fundamentalist Islamic rule. What does it mean? These others have heard about it, and they have seen it every now and then, just corners of it. Whatever Daesh is doing now in Iraq and in Syria, the Islamic Republic has done much worse than that. Daesh is cutting head. They have done it. Look at the pictures of the people that they have assassinated, they have murdered throughout these years in the name of Islam. And look at the number of people who died in the war with Iraq. And look at the poverty and discrepancy of income between rich and poor in Iran. So I think more than anybody, Iranians today know better what fundamentalist Islamic State means, better than any other people. The Saudis, of course, they have been seeing it for a long time, but the condition of education and culture of the country in Saudi Arabia is very much different from Iran. Iranians have shown that they cannot tolerate separation of men and women. But Saudis haven't shown it throughout their history. So if one country in the region is going to have an important role to play in the life of the region, it's going to be Iran.
In closing, I want to ask you this one question. How do you think history will judge the Shah in the future?
I think history would look at him as a man with dedication to help his country, dedication to move the country forward, dedication to remove the vestiges of foreign control and foreign influence, dedication to create a more just society and more free and equal society. I think when we look at it, all the statements he had, the things he had been saying, especially in the last 7, 8 years, 10 years of his rule, show that. And the time would have definitely had effect on him to move in that direction. And also the Iranian people. Don't forget that when the revolution happened, we had over 10 million children in our schools out of a population of 35 million. So 1 in every 3 Iranian was attending a school. If today you have 4 million or 4.5 million in the universities in Iran, it is all because of what we were doing in the elementary, secondary schools at that time, which was preparing the ground for what we see today in Iran.
The last few years of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's reign in Iran were turbulent times, even more so than his first 3 decades in power. As the crisis reached fever pitch in 1978, the Shah's inability to act, combined with poor decision-making, all the while secretly fighting his illness, proved fatal for his life and the Pahlavi reign.